Hello, well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this panel, Co-Producing Down Under. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to talk about Australian co-productions. I'm not going to be long explaining what we're speaking about, but because of for that, it's Christine Reisen here. But I want to welcome you on behalf of Documentary Campus. Thank you for being here, and hopefully you enjoy the panel. Thanks.
Can we have those lights down?
Thank you, Antonella, and thank you for coming. And welcome to this industry panel about co-producing Down Under. Australia is an extraordinary territory indeed for teaming up with talented and like-minded people. It's also extraordinarily complex as a territory, and that's why we try to explore a little bit this landscape with a variety of small case studies and perspectives, and that together with European and Australian producers as well as the main Australian broadcasters. I'm Christine Reisen. I'm German in France and working now as an independent consultant after over 20 years of being commissioning and co-producing with Arte France. I will try to guide you safely and soberly through this through this journey. And as a session we want to have, it's meant to be hands-on and to allow you to go away with some more new insights, hopefully. So we have a wonderful panel, and I mean it. We will starring the people in the order from the left. Luc Martin-Gousset, Point du Jour, producer. Tim Slade from Vars Production in Australia, producer. He's living in New York, but he's still an Australian producer and director. Eric Vernier from Mona Lisa Film in France. Joseph Maxwell, commissioner SBS. Margie Bryant, producer Serendipity Productions in Australia. And Chris Thornburn from ABC. Hello. And after that, we are coming back to me, and then if ever there are questions, we try to find time for a Q&A. Well, so the floor is to Luc and Tim, who eventually are only working part-time because they're sharing their 15 minutes, so the floor is yours.
So thanks for you to come. And I guess it's Tim, since he's the guy who initiated the project that will start.
Okay. So our project's called The Garden. It's a French-Australian co-production, obviously. It is a story that we came across when we were actually researching for another project, and we sort of found this forgotten, hidden story about this quite amazing encounter that happened between the French, who had been sent to try and find La Perouse, the missing explorer, and an Aboriginal tribe in the very south of Tasmania during 1 week in 1793. It's this very unique story in terms of the level of interaction and understanding that happened between these two very different groups of people. So we were sort of immediately captivated by the story and wanted to do something with it, so we began developing ideas for a documentary film. We started to talk to Screen Australia about it and realised through Claire Jager, who used to work there, that there was another producer in Tasmania looking at the same story who'd been sort of equally captivated by it. So we teamed forces. It seemed to make a lot of sense. And we applied for development money from Screen Tasmania and began developing the script. And at that point realised, of course, that it would be something that would need French engagement to actually make the film happen. So that led our co-producer Troy from Tasmania to Luc. And do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and then, in fact, it's through, Troy was introduced to Arte, and Arte was advising several producers in France for working for them. So he made some meetings 2 years ago with several producers, and I must say that for us it has been a very simple process from the very beginning. So have been tested by Troy, as it's the rule when you meet people, and tested on the synopsis he has sent us, and tested on the way we envision the co-production. And then after 2 months, and I guess after discussing with Tim, he came back to me, it was I guess in the fall of 2011, to tell us that he would like to pursue with us. So it means that we had first to convince Arte with a synopsis. And we have to start with people we have not even seen, because Tim was in New York. Troy, I saw him once, and then afterwards he was not there. So you could think that it could be a big deal. In fact, it was a very simple thing through mails and Skype and some phone calls, and it went much better than we could have expected. So we go to the only concern that the things which have been a bit complex and that could have a bit slowed down the process was regarding that story with 2 co-producers, 2 broadcasters, at least 1 Arte, and at least people from Australia. We were at that time represented by people from the Screen Australia a group that were discussing and had some perhaps different vision of that story that engaged both Australian and French. And so the process of writing the synopsis had been just complicated just for being sure that the question of hook be the same or be different for a French version and an Australian version, without starting to fall in that sort of complex things with too many versions that could kill a budget and a production. And so quite quickly we got this synopsis, and I guess that we had worked a bit together, so it started to work well, and we met in New York. I mean, because at a certain stage of the process we had to meet together. It was in January 2012, meaning 6 months after the beginning of the work. And things went well with Arte. We got a commitment for developing a real scenario. And the interesting thing is the way we made the trailer, because we didn't know each other and we wanted to test how it works together. And again, we have been able to conceive the trailer with Tim in New York, people, the sound people in Australia, and the graphic people and the effect people in Paris. So we'll take just 5 minutes for telling that, but before I want to show you the trailer.
Head for the Admiralty Islands, where the French uniforms we hope as those of La Pérouse and his men were last seen. The shortest route is to sail north of New Holland, but after 21 days at sea, the winds are constantly against us. Under Mr. Kemadek's command, the Espérance is slow. The pace between the ships drags. The Admiral decides to pass south of New Holland, so Labillardière, Rich and I can conduct research on the southwest coast. Time passes slowly. 5 weeks drag by from the Cape. Today is just like yesterday. The winds are too gentle, the ocean endless. Ladder beetles spread from old sea biscuits which have already been at sea before our expedition. They breed and they are even hungrier than we are. Just as the 6th long week begins, the winds pick up and the trouble starts. After the storm, we will seek refuge in the land of the Lelukone people. I will see Mara for the first time.
What we're doing with this piece is not really a trailer in a certain sense. This was also developed with Screen Australia at this point, just jumping into the story. What we're doing here is looking at different styles that we're going to use in the film, and obviously, CGI and 3D is one of them. So we were testing that process and what it would look like for this particular element of the film. And as Luke says, it was it was sort of quite a seamless process working with, obviously complex ideas between people who speak different languages natively. So that's what we see there. And
then, just for emphasizing, then after we have this whole process of writing, since it was a docudrama, of writing a real scenario. And that was quite an amazing experience and process because, again, it was just with English that I'm not fluent in, but that was our language of work, that we have been able to work with Tim as the main scriptwriters and a French co-scriptwriters. And through a process back and forth, a very simple process through mails, through phone calls, through Skype, we have been able to go through 7 versions at the end and get Arte in board on a when you could imagine that it could have been very complex, just because people were able to talk to each other, to explain how they see everything, the reason for which they wanted such character or such sequence or such essence. It has been a very, very smooth process that has led to the fact that we have Arte on board and we are still looking for Australian broadcasters. But what I want to emphasize is that how international co-production, even in terms of, even when you don't see each other, could have been a very, very simple process if you are with people who do understand what does it mean to work together. And I must say, for me, we have done a lot of co-production with Canada, with Israel, with, I'm still surprised. So I don't know if it's because of Australian people and a sort of national character, but I must say that it was a quite exciting experience.
Yeah, and I think where we're at now is obviously that we're at a point now where we're looking at as French audiences and Australian audiences and how to engage the film in terms of versions slightly differently. For Australia, it's sort of, this story intersects with looking at what this story tells us about ourselves, why it was neglected, importantly, which is an important aspect to it too, what that sort of reveals about our psyche and history and how that can sort of help heal and direct the way that we are as a country and the way that we...
maybe just to end, it's because we have been really helped by this unique story, which is quite rare in terms of stories, which is that you have stories that concern the 2 people who are co-producing. So in terms of scenario, you have a sort of balance in between what each side could have expected from the scenario, just because you have your stage on one side, some French people coming out from the revolution, the French Revolution, at a moment of when the only thing that the king and the Constituent Assembly could agree on was to set that expedition. And these guys who, in a way, brought with them a period of time as it was freezed on the boat with royalist, republican scientists sailing to Australia, meeting this guy from Tasmania, and all of a sudden meeting these natives as if they were people from 4,000 years settlement, 4,000 kilometers from France, as if they have met the good sauvage, the good native depicted by Rousseau when they left. So that story, naturally speaking, bridge a French history, a French moment of history, and an Australian moment of history. And I guess it has helped to make it a very simple thing to develop in terms of co-production.
Yeah, indeed. Look, that leads us to the question of domestic content, which might always be an issue for some broadcasters. So here's the ideal case of having domestic content for both sides. It was also a unique story because it was there were two Australian broadcasters coming to a French broadcaster and working together with Screen Australia to get the thing developed. That was I was involved in during my time in art, and it's very nice to see now after, let's say, 5 years. I first met Troy in Australia, that now we are here together on the panel. So there's a nice story. We have domestic content, we have producers on both sides, and eventually it will work out with a very nice film. We have a second case coming from, it's very exclusive in fact, coming from a French production and making it breaking through into the Australian market. And Eric will tell us more about this extraordinary project.
Okay, hello. So this film is called Life on Us, and it's a primetime presentation for Arte, Sunday night primetime. First, before we discuss the film and the production, just a word about the origins of the film. Basically, Mona Lisa production has a sort of long expertise and history with footage coming from electronic microscope. We did a series, we started a series in the year 2000 called a 10-part series, which was called Squatters, about acarids and all kind of bugs and creatures, and this was really the start of it. So 2 years ago, we thought we would take a new angle on doing a film or a primetime, a special on creatures. So I think the best now is to see the trailer.
That man has explored, there is one whose landscapes never cease to surprise us. On its surface, lush forests alternate with grassy steppes and arid plains. Its depths are crossed by a labyrinth of caverns and underground rivers where extreme conditions reign. A myriad of ecosystems that are home to creatures as fascinating as they are unsettling. If the landscapes of this planet appear strangely familiar to you, it is because they are those of your own body. Welcome to Planet Us. Discover how we are all rented, shared, and shaped by the bugs that live on us and inside us.
Okay, so the angle on this film is very simply to explore the symbiosis between the human body and our parasites, or hosts and bacteria and stuff. And it's also, and possibly we can have a brief look at the PowerPoint. It's also to capture and portray our body as an ecosystem, and to do a parallel with planet Earth. This is how we're supposed to, yeah. Okay, so this is how we can discuss or or introduce basically how we co-produce this film with Smith & Nash in Australia for SBS, and what are the basic differences and history on this. Well, first we signed the development with Arte in February 2011, and Pierre-François Gaudry, who's the director of the film and exec producer, met with Anna Maria, director at Smith & Nash at World Congress the same year, and that's where we started working together. The real thing is we are doing two different films, actually, one for Arte and one for SBS. Our film, and we have a multiplicity of formats. Our film is first a 90-minute, hosted by a scientist, biologist, Franck Courchamp, and we are shooting him on location in La Réunion, volcanic island, to show the parallels between the human body and the Earth. So that's one format. We are declining this in a 2-hour also for Arte. And on the other side, our friends from Smith & Nash are doing a 2-hour version for SBS, but it's not going to be hosted. And, but it's totally different in the approach and the way it's structured. So that's really our history of production. It's several formats and two different films in the same pool. So I wonder if maybe, Joseph, you would like to say on the editorial point of view, what's the difference between our, Arte, European, and...
It's really interesting. When I was pitched this idea, I was pitched it by a showreel that showed some of the incredible microphotography that these guys do. And I kind of thought, if you could get a film where within 5 minutes the viewer starts to look at the back of their hand in a slightly different way, to really make it feel about themselves, there was a real power and potency there. But our version will be really different, I think. I mean, it's interesting seeing that trailer, that's a very different tone from how we would have. And I don't want to get ahead, because in a way I'll describe a bit how the what the character of the broadcasters in Australia are, because there's two main broadcasters, the ABC and SBS, and we each have our own kind of separate DNA, and I hope in this session we can give you an idea of what's kind of different about it. But this was certainly one of those things that I immediately felt, science is a great international co-production tool. There's those great things that can cross borders, and the extraordinary bugs on us and in us is a natural way to get into that. I'll talk later a bit about the kind of Australian content that we need, but it was one of those times when as soon as I saw that, I thought, yeah, we're on to something here, I think.
Okay. So, well, just budget-wise, maybe this can be interesting, just a very basic figure. Doing a co-production, I'm doing, in a way, two different films and at least a multiplicity of formats means also a high budget. We are producing at 1.4 million euros overall, and we are on a 70-30, French, Australian cut, which is quite, traditional. Also, well, Joseph mentioned the editorial side of the CoPro, the two angles from the two channels, Arte and SBS. What is quite interesting also on this CoPro is very basically from the future distribution side, we are in advanced discussions with Discovery Europe now for airing this film in Europe. What is interesting is although this deal will be a European one, obviously the broadcasters can access all formats. We work as a pool, and it's very likely that Discovery will be more inclined to take the Australian version. So I think that's quite interesting to see how the content will absolutely travel back and forth between Australia and Europe as a sort of hands-on example. And just to finish on this, this slideshow shows you very basically our approach, which we are doing especially in the French version, which is a parallel between the Earth and the human body. And this is what we were shooting very recently in La Réunion Island, shooting our host, Franck Courchamp, the biologist, on many kind of sceneries. And then on screen, of course, we'll show the parallel. Okay, so pretty obvious when you see the skin and the volcanic Earth. Works also with the intestine, etc., etc., etc.
That's certainly very, very beautiful and as intimate as global, so you understand very quickly why it could interest at the other side of the world. Joseph will tell us a little bit more about the DNA you just mentioned and how you can interest SBS also for another kind of program.
I don't know how much you all know about the Australian market, so I'll just quickly take a step back. So you've got your two public service broadcasters, the ABC and SBS, and we're the smaller of the public service broadcasters. It's quite a complex, as you can tell, I'm from Britain originally and recently moved to Australia for this commissioning role. And it's quite an eye-opener. Australia is a very... the funding models, which we'll talk about, is all quite complicated. So Screen Australia, essentially what happens is if I get interested in a project, I trigger a waterfall of other money. That's the simple fact. So if you can get an Australian, Chris or I are interested in something, we then trigger money from Screen Australia, from tax offsets and so on. But what I'd suggest you do is, you have to kind of know who you're pitching to. So for me, I think we're a bit more interesting than the ABC. No, I don't know.
Come on, let's have a good
what we look to do, when you're a small broadcaster, what the hell do you do to get to your audience? Well, you try and, what we try and do is to be quite provocative with what we do. So one of the scenes I'm really looking forward to, this is what I mean about tonally, this feels like great relevant science. What actually got me really excited about the project was hearing about fecal transplants, which is basically reintroducing feces into someone else whose own microbes have been so damaged and destroyed. When I look at, I'm really looking forward to seeing that sequence and how they handle that. So I do like, for us, there's a kind of a tone that you need, a bit of a cheek, a bit of an edge, a bit of provocation. Science is definitely a key area, but I'm just going to talk about a few other different areas as well. We did a co-production about Rupert Murdoch. So we like to find provocative topics. Well, Rupert Murdoch is a great example of that. So we've done a co-pro with Brooke Lapping, Electric Pictures in Australia, Brooke Lapping over here for ITV. Now, kindly, ITV have let me play this clip because similarly, I don't think they've seen this, they don't know what it is. This is absolutely the SBS version. ITV are holding back for various legal reasons their TX till sometime later in the year. Already this is out of date because we talk about how in love Wendy Deng and Rupert Murdoch are, so that's all old news now. But let's just have a quick, I'm just going to play you a pre-title of our Rupert Murdoch. Yeah,
Rupert Murdoch divides opinion like no other.
He's a warrior prince.
Ambitious.
Begins with B.
Amazing.
Pragmatic. Got a D at the end.
Mercurial.
Canny.
Ruthless.
Visionary.
Innovator.
Genius.
Mischievous.
Dynamo.
Love him or loathe him, Rupert Murdoch is the most powerful media mogul of all time. Starting with one small paper in Adelaide, over the last 60 years, Murdoch has built an empire worth billions, spanning newspapers, publishing, television, blockbuster films, and the internet, whose presence is felt in practically every corner of the globe.
Rupert Murdoch has had more influence on the world business scene than any other Australian.
His dynasty seemed assured. His youngest son was destined to succeed him. And his third marriage to a glamorous younger wife gave him 2 more children. A Hollywood A-lister and political power broker, he had a hotline to presidents and prime ministers everywhere.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes.
The reality is they were shit scared of him, shit scared of his newspapers.
But all that was before this.
Mr. Murdoch, what was
The British phone hacking scandal has rocked his family dynasty to its foundations.
This is the most humble day of my life.
This is the final edition of tomorrow's News of the World.
There have now been 30 arrests in total.
The relationship has been too close.
Rupert certainly didn't encourage the behaviour that's gone on, but a general dose of naughtiness was encouraged and rewarded at the papers.
At an age when most tycoons have retired to the golf course, Rupert Murdoch's been embroiled in the biggest battle of his life.
I'm not making any comments.
To salvage his legacy and his dynasty. But who is the enigmatic figure who dominates so much of the world's media? And what drives him on? This is the story of the man behind the empire and how he got there.
So that clip's interesting for me because it's clearly, again, I'll take a step back. For us to commission anything, we've got to have an Australian angle. Sadly, Chris and I are both hampered by the fact that a lot of our content on Australian screens is international, is acquired content. So for us to commission anything, it has to have an Australian angle. And that is absolutely crucial, otherwise we can't continue that conversation. So clearly, Rupert Murdoch is great. He kind of absolutely bridges, well, he's kind of globally, he's such a big figure, but also he's such a provocative figure, and that's what worked brilliantly for us. I think that the fact is, it is really hard to find those subjects that do cross over all of those international boundaries and have got that Australian content within it. But I think there are pretty good rewards, actually. I mean, there is a really good amount of money you can tap into in Australia, and some really good Australian production companies. And I should add as well, we can only, if I like a project, I can't give it straight to my French colleagues. It has to go to an Australian production company. So you need to forge that relationship. But at the moment, we've got sort of science series with the Smithsonian. We've got, here's a good example. We've managed to find an Australian angle on the assassination of JFK, which I think is quite a good feat. It's actually an Australian murder detective who's got this brilliant analysis and exploration. So I'm always looking to find how I can do more international co-productions. The fact is, back in Australia, I'm bound by certain limits of what I can spend. The one area where I've got more leeway is through the international door. And I get really pissed off with the ABC because they can do brilliant natural history wildlife projects which can get international funding. We don't do that at all. So we have to be kind of boxed quite clever about where can we find our international content.
Sorry.
Well, yes, I know. You make my life much more difficult. So yeah, so we don't do any wildlife at all. No natural history, no arts projects. Oh, excuse me.
Is that you or me?
I get overexcited when I start talking and knock off my microphone, excuse me. But I'll give you an idea about how you can also be clever with Australian content. And this is a bit of a cheat, I'm afraid, but I really wanted to show it. I'm going to show you a clip from a show called The Network, which has just been on here in Sheffield. And this is a documentary about the establishment of kind of an independent media station in Afghanistan. And the person who set it up is an Afghan Australian. And a bit of context for us. We were originally set up to explore multicultural Australia. That's the purpose of SBS. And all of our domestic commissions explore multicultural Australia. And there's a huge hysteria, really, about kind of boat people and refugees, and that's often focused on the Afghan population. This guy is called the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan, so he absolutely turns that idea on his head. This wasn't an international co-pro, but it had some international money, but could very easily have been. And this is another example of how it's not set in Australia, really it's about Afghanistan, but there was enough, the fact that he was Australian-Afghan at the centre of it was why we commissioned it. So if I could just show the quick pre-title of The Network.
We went to this public execution, and they brought this guy into the stadium, and he was accused of murdering a relative. A man who looked like maybe he was about 22, 23 years old. And then the judge went through the whole sermon of, explaining why it's under Sharia law. This guy has murdered somebody, and the only way to restore justice is for the relatives to either forgive or to kill him. And then the relatives, the people were like, oh, let's forgive him. And the guy said no, and then they picked up the gun. And I was like within maybe about 2-3 meters away from him, 10 to 15 feet. And they brought in and just shot him in the head. And when as he was dying, he was making this like, like a purring sound. You know how the cat's like, purr. And that image stuck with me. And it was pretty shocking because I remember getting out of the stadium with the crowd, and I was in shock. That had become the only entertainment in the city. There was nothing else. Imagine that you're dying slowly and you don't know it. That was the thing, because there was so much suffering, there was so much pain that the country had completely shut down, so people didn't have access to media to listen to or hear what's happening in the world. We really thought this was life.
in many ways, I think that's a really good example of SBS. It's a really bold piece of filmmaking by Ava Orner, who's a fantastic, well, that's actually her first time. She won an Oscar as a producer on Taxi to the Dark Side. And this is her big directing debut, really. It tackles some really big issues and big themes. It's a really gripping watch. And for us, we're always looking at how, being a small broadcaster with a chip on our shoulder, of how we can do things a bit differently, how we can tackle really big, bold subjects, how we can stir up debate and be provocative. And I think tonally, you know, the ABC and us do have very distinct, you know, there might be the occasional project we will fight over, but in usual, we have our pretty distinct tones. And I think if you can come away from this getting that idea, I think that would really help. And probably the other best way to do it is to make sure you talk to some of the Australian producers. I mean, Margie's here, there's a couple of other Australian producers, to get an idea of what channels like, what they want, and what works for them. I'll just briefly add, if you haven't got any Australian content but you are trying to get some money, there's one other avenue into SBS, which is obviously acquisitions, but pre-sales as well. And we've got an office in London, and we do put pre-sale money into a lot of projects. So if we really want something, we will go after it. That needs to have no Australian angle or content whatsoever. That's just our desire to make sure we get the best of the projects.
Joseph, a couple of things I wanted to pick up on that you said that I hope would be useful to the audience, and that is just to reiterate that obviously with science you don't need an Australian angle if it's universal science, like the project you guys are doing together, is that right?
Well, no, but it was really interesting. I sort of gone back, it's a really good question. With Life on Us, I said, I love this project, but what the hell is the Australian angle? And they went, yeah, there is. There's lots of Australian scientists. And then they went away and came back and they went, look, we've got a really fascinating scientist looking into mosquitoes up in Northern Australia. We've got the fecal transplant guy is in Queensland. We've got this. And so they came back and found enough scientists and content. I mean, so it's not that the microbes have to be Australian, but they did find some leading voices that were Australian. And again, our version is going to be quite different. We're using some dramatised sections, which we're all doing in Australia. And there are rules about how much budget and so on is spent in Australia. But that was a dialogue where I went, I love this project, can we find the Australian angle? And they came back very quickly and reassured me they could, and they have.
Are you doing any Australian landscapes type things as well, Joseph, or is it?
There is some landscape. I mean, there's a lot of location shooting we've done within Australia. Right. But it's always, there's that dialogue of can we get enough of that Australian content.
Just a word on the difference, and you tell me if I'm wrong or right, Joseph, but the difference between the French and or Arte and Australian version. First, you're actually going to see some medical cases quite extraordinary in the Australian versions, which we are not going to see in the Arte version. And some of them a little bit gory, yes, if I may say.
Yeah, we love a bit of gore, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's some really shocking... the producer sent me these disgusting videos, which is really kind of horrendous and gripping. As someone's, I think it was their foot, kind of... Have you seen that?
No, not
I should have brought clips of it, that you would have loved it. But anyway, no, so yes, we'll absolutely have some kind of personal case studies and stories, some of which are Australian, some American, and so forth.
So that's one obvious difference. And the other difference is, as you mentioned, the transition between the liaison between all the sort of hard science sequences is going to be in sort of family being filmed in a sort of ideal house, and it's going to be a little bit glamorous, I would say, or day to day. And so this is going to be different between, well, it's going to be only in the Smith and Nash version.
Yeah, they will be very different, absolutely, kind of tonally, and the devices that we're using. But we're making essentially use of the key cell of this, which is there's this fantastic microphotography that lets you see our human bodies as this incredible teeming ecosystem, and some really brilliant cutting-edge science within that content that's explored, I think, in a very kind of accessible, relevant way.
But perhaps you could just add, I'm sure you're born to do it, the boxes you have to tick to enter into the editorial lines of SBS. You have, I think, a 5 points program, because you could come on board of things where there's no domestic content whatsoever. If
there's not, no, we have to have some Australian angle for us to follow it, absolutely.
Anyway, okay,
we always have to have that. But it really is, for us, it's about, I think the kind of a key area is about provoking debate. whether it's in a science story, whether it's a contemporary story, whether it's historical. We look to have that provocative edge. If there's something that has a real social purpose, that is about inspiring change. We showed a clip the other day about a show called Jabbed, about the vaccination debate. And that was absolutely about a kind of key topical issue, and it was about inspiring change because there's been a fall-off in vaccination rates. We look to really kind of push boundaries in how we will approach a story. You know, if you're doing it in a very innovative way, maybe it's some huge stunt or something like that. Those are kind of important agenda points for us. So it is, I come back, I mean, maybe Margie will, I don't know, follow up and talking with Chris as well, you'll get a sense of tonally how we are different from the ABC.
Could we leave just the Q&A to the end? That would be great. Yeah.
We'll cover that, absolutely. Yeah. We'll make sure we do.
Yeah, great. So we had the domestic content who is necessary for you directly. So European or international producers have to team up anyway with the Australian producer. If not, there's always this entry possible by the window in London. London office is Andrew Golding for arts and Jane Roscoe, who recently came to take over the international relations.
Right. Yeah, so Jane Roscoe, shall I give out her email address? She'll love it. Jane.Roscoe, R-O-S-C-O-E, @sbs.com.au.
You're very frisky today.
I am, I'm excited. You know, I can see everyone's a bit hungover. We need a bit of energy.
Yeah, you know. Absolutely.
She's in charge of all our pre-sales and acquisitions, and Andrew Golding looks after potentially our arts. We actually have an arts channel called Studio, which is a pure arts channel. It doesn't have much money, but it has some fantastic shows. So those are ways into it with zero Australian content, but some possibilities. And as I say, about, I don't know, 80, 90% of our schedule is acquired content from abroad. So there's lots of opportunity to get your shows on in Australia through that route.
Yeah, thanks. Margie, your perspective as an Australian producer.
I'll say that it's Margie. Everybody calls me Margie in Europe, and I feel like I'm a character in The Simpsons, which is not particularly... mind you, I really think Rupert Murdoch looks like Bart Simpson, don't you?
Oh, really?
Absolutely, when I saw that clip. The other thing to say about SBS, which is 3 years ago we did a session here at Sheffield called Doing Business with SBS, because there had been a perception, because they're the smaller broadcaster, that they don't have any money. But I like to go around the world telling the stories, much as I love working with the ABC as well, that they pay exactly the same amount of money in a co-production situation as the bigger broadcaster, because there are set licence fees that our broadcasters have to put in if they are going to enter into co-productions with international money. So you're not going to get less money by going to SBS than you would going to the ABC. I just think that's worth...
We might give more, in fact.
They might give more, and a very good example of that for me, and something that changed my whole life really, was getting up the series of Who Do You Think You Are with SBS. So I'm a co-producer on the Australian series of Who Do You Think You Are, which is about to go into its 6th series, and that's been a really life-changing thing for me, because a returning series, as we probably all know in this room, is kind of the holy grail, and there aren't that many of them on Australian television. But what I'd really like to ask you guys, if you don't mind, if you could put up your hand how many Brits there are in the room. Okay, so lots of Brits. I know there's a very good German friend there, Daniel Petrie, who I've worked with, and there's some French people, given we've got French. Okay, great. So I've got a clip that I would love this conversation to be useful to you. Given there are a number of Brits here, I feel a bit better about the clip I'm about to show. But I think the thing that excites me about staying in this business, if you're tenacious, it is amazing what can happen. So, you know, we often in Australia talk about coming to Britain, it's like trying to bring coal to Newcastle, to try and get shows up here, or, you know, be able to have these collaborations. And I find that in the UK, and I believe Australia's always been this way, but the UK is becoming a little bit more open to co-producing because money is short. So the great thing about working with Australia, if you can make it work, is that the money is significant when you enter into a co-production. And this program that I'm going to show you a clip of, my big thing at the moment working with the ABC is that I'm doing 2 series with the ABC and the BBC, and I'm working very hard at keeping those very, very close in the versions. So you've heard two examples of very different versions, but the two shows that I'm doing with the BBC, they're just going to be 3 or 4 minutes longer, and pretty well, you know, everything else about them will be similar. Very, very similar. A little bit of context, maybe an extra line of com here and there, because the
That's your hope. We'll see the reality.
Yeah, we'll
Margie.
see the reality.
See.
And the other thing that I think is quite interesting for me at the moment in the two shows that I'm doing with the BBC and the ABC is that they're presenter-led. And I guess it's more difficult. We've had an example here of where the host is being taken out. I'm fortunate that my hosts speak English, and funnily enough, the first clip that I'll show you, and I may not show you the second, is with a British host. And the second is with an Australian host, although he really is British. He's just been living in Australia for 33 years, and I think that probably helped and made a little bit of a difference of being able to sell him. Although, having said that, we started out with an Australian host, and the BBC wanted that host very much. It was helped that he'd just won a Pulitzer Prize, I think, but he had to pull out, and he was pure 100% Australian, whereas my new host is a Brit who's been living in Australia for 33 years. So I'll just show you this little clip. This is the Wizards of Oz, the Vimeo, and then maybe just say a little bit about how that project came up for me.
All these 4 Australians are capable of ripping you apart with their teeth. It isn't just that they're clever. Every one of them is dangerous. They were probably 4 of the most unafraid people we had ever seen.
I'm here to meet Clive James off the Cambridge train, and I admit, full of apprehensions. I haven't seen him for 3 or 4 years, and I know he's been very ill. I don't know how he looks. I don't think I could bear it if he comes off the train looking fragile. I think of him as such a strong and powerful man. I associate his intelligence with that weight. We'll see how he is. Hey, Clive. Clive. How fantastic to see you. How are you?
How good to see you.
You look great. You look strong. I was expecting a little old man cricking out, little hobbling.
That's the way I do look when I'm acting for you.
I look good. How have you been?
I'm doing my best to hold myself up. I haven't been great, Howard. It's been
No, I know. I've been reading.
It's been a tough couple of years.
Well, I mean, some of your poems make it sound
as if it's all over.
Terrible, yes.
Yes, well,
yes.
My friend P.J. O'Rourke has told me several times not to overdo this death's door stuff or people will get impatient.
Yes. So we're going to get a taxi.
Okay.
To Soho.
Yeah, I should stay out of the cold.
To Soho, yes. Well, let's get you out of the cold. I think the taxi's up here.
You're my favourite talker anyway. My favourite guest.
I remember the day I arrived here. I just can't remember the year.
When did you actually go up to Cambridge?
64.
So you came, I'd gone. I was trying to work out whether we could have been in Cambridge at the same time. So you came in the same year as Jermaine. You and Jermaine
right, yeah.
hit Cambridge, running, both of you, at 64.
It's good we're getting all this, because I've quite likely conk out in another hour or so. And you'll be left with the taxi conversation.
There is a film I saw recently of you and Robert Hughes talking about the Beatniks. Wonderful, pedantic.
I know exactly the piece of film you used.
It's 1959, so you were babies.
I wouldn't call Beat a creative movement. The thing about Beat is that it's a quest for experience. They just like to take in raw experience. They like to dig everything, man, you know.
And there's Robert Hughes, a dandy, with soft, long, llama-like lashes. You look good too.
I'm not making any overt criticism of it. I'd just like you to notice, for one thing, this superfluity of adjectives, which seems to me to indicate a lack of discipline.
What interests me is, well, there you are and you're a literary critic. You're actually doing literary criticism on television. And then you think of Barry Humphries, who is a great critic of language, is he not?
I like the word chunder very much, which was Barry Mackenzie's for being sick, you know, sort of enjoying oneself in reverse, as it were.
Jermaine too. The 4 of you, you were all critics. Was that one of the reasons you were able to take the British by storm?
I think it's true that we had fun expressing our opinions. We're not a shy, retiring people. Rather different from the locals, as I always call them. I still call the British the locals. This is still a country where you ask permission to speak up. The Australians didn't. We had an opinion about something and we expressed it. And we'd had plenty of practice in expressing it.
And I don't think we are ever again obliged to look at a plywood box or a row of bricks on the floor or a videotape of some twit from the University of Central Paranoia sticking pins in himself and think, this is the real thing.
When I became a TV critic for The Observer in 1972, I think, nothing was more natural to me in the world than to say what I thought. It was a big advantage to come from a country where saying what you think is something you do all the time.
He said one of your recorded sketches is about an Australian in Earl's Court. We all used to live there. I mean, now it's South African puffs, I think.
Sometimes people bristle when they hear it. The Australians were less mealy-mouthed. They were sometimes horrifying to hear.
Jermaine was terrifying. When I went to Australia, I took what was virtually Jermaine's job, and someone who'd worked that out arranged for me to meet Jermaine just as I was leaving Cambridge to go to Australia, and she was a formidable force.
And because we are unfortunately improper goddesses and unwilling menials, there is a battle waged between us.
She's terrifying even now. And she was terrifying when we were all in Australia. First of all, she has a formidable intellect and has a tremendous way of expressing herself directly, sometimes more than directly. I think it's true to say of her that she's not a miracle of objectivity. She talks for victory. I think, didn't they used to say that in the 18th century? I think Samuel Johnson said it. I talk for victory. She talks for victory. Barry is overwhelming. You've met him. He's one of the most learned men in the world. He left John Betjeman feeling ignorant. There are all kinds of stuff that Barry knows. It's tough to keep up with him.
You're all tough to keep up with.
Well, Hughes was impossible to keep up with. For one thing, Hughes was stuck on send and not receive.
You think you're easy to keep up with?
Yes, I do. Compared with Hughes, I didn't see much of Bob in these last few years. After the car crash, actually. There was a good reason for that. Is that when I did meet him, the first thing he does is invite me to join him deep-sea fishing in Cape Cod or something. Now, the last thing I wanted to do in the world was be on the deep-sea fishing with Bob, because he's too intense.
You know, when I look at a thing like this, I realise that so much of it, not all of it, thank God, but a lot of it, has just become a kind of cruddy game for the self-aggrandizement of the rich and the ignorant.
Given the number of impressive Australians who'd come over here, why did you lot, why did you bunch have that special éclat that you did?
I think our timing by accident was right. The British loved Australia anyway. It was their promised land, and we were represented as if we'd walked out of the sun.
It's our promised land. Is it our promised land because it's a way of actually going home and having home better? Because I feel simultaneously, whenever I go back to Australia, I feel as I felt at the time, that this is somewhere unlike anywhere else, and yet it's also like home.
It's a warmer version of home when the prawns don't come out of a can. I don't think you should get too fancy about it, Howard.
But it's still there, the old nostalgia for it, when the band played and the cicadas sang.
I loved the trip.
And we went sailing. We went
sailing to adventure. And guess what? It happened.
Let me tell you about this fantastical boat of my imagination.
I would like to leave this city.
Late in 1964, I sailed.
Very long, but I'm not going to say much. So I think what's very interesting for me about this is that you've got a very big British cultural figure there, Howard Jacobson, who's a journalist, won the Booker Prize. And, you know, why him to be the person that's going to tell Australian audiences about themselves and about their culture as seen through these sort of fairly big characters. And I think what really worked for the broadcaster was that this Brit, Howard Jacobson, actually has quite, he has a profile in Australia. Booker Prize winner, he taught at Sydney University, he took Germaine Greer's place. But I think what was most important to me is when you find a host that has an authentic story. And Howard Jacobson wrote an obituary in the Independent newspaper in England, which was kind of a love song to Australia. So it was an obituary of Robert Hughes. And when I read this, I thought, you know, even I've met people at this market that have said to me, oh God, I really thought about doing that lot years ago, those 4 Australians. And it was just a moment in time, and obviously now that Bob Hughes is dead, it's kind of a different sort of film to if he'd been still living. But it was Howard Jacobson's point of view that I finally thought we could make a film that could work really well for Britain as well as for Australia, because we've got this person who wants to say things about these 4 Australians. So for me, what was really great is that I didn't get stuck in this scenario where the Australian audiences or the Australian broadcaster would be saying to me, and they could, why do we want a Brit telling us about ourselves? Because this is going to be a kind of a social history. And I do apologise that was so long. That's the sort of a trailer that we use to let the broadcasters know, you know, that it would be archive, it would be big interview pieces, and that, you know, the journey would be Howard's journey. So for me, it was probably one of the easiest sells I've ever had as a producer. And there's a lot of luck in that. I think it depends on who the commissioning editor is. You know, Chris sitting beside me is much more interested, I think, and I'll let him speak for himself, in very contemporary. He's the commissioning editor for contemporary stories. This is a kind of a very different beast, and it is being commissioned by the arts department, which probably wouldn't surprise you. So really, I think I haven't had the good fortune of working with the French. Arte have a long tradition of putting money into Australian co-productions. There does seem to be a very nice kind of bond there. You'd think it would be easier with the Brits, but it hasn't always been. And, you know, I think it is about relationships. And I formed a relationship with Howard Jacobson. That's really how this film got away. With this one, I don't have a British co-producer. It's a direct commission with the BBC. On the other project that I'm doing at the moment, which is a 3-part series, again, you would never dream that the Brits would buy into this. It's a 3-part history of Australia as told through its art. So it's called The Art of Australia. And that has a co-producing partner in the UK. I actually had the commission before I got the co-producing partner, and that co-producing partner is Wall to Wall. Because of my relationship with Who Do You Think You Are, they were, you know, a very good partner to have on the British version of this show, which, as I said, I hope will only be different by about a 3-minute duration. So I feel very fortunate at the moment that, you know, I have managed to get these co-productions up in the UK. I don't think it's easy, in the same way that it's not that easy for a UK producer, and I'd love to know if there are any UK producers here who have managed to get, you know, co-productions up in Australia. Maybe a show of hands. Are there producers who've done shows with Australia here? I think I can see in the back there my wonderful colleague and co-owner of Who Do You Think You Are in Australia. Is that you, Celia?
No.
At the back? No. Sorry, the lights are very difficult. Artemis, who make Who Do You Think You Are with SBS and myself, they've done a lot of co-productions with UK producers. There are a number of Australians that are doing that, and Chris might talk a little bit more. Joseph mentioned Brooke Lapping. Interestingly, the new head of factual at ABC is ex-Brooke Lapping, recently appointed to be the head of factual. His name is Phil Craig. So there are some lovely Brits working in Australia, and, you know, I think the British have probably got a good moment in time to be able to talk directly to those commissioning editors. We've got a new head of content at SBS, Alison Sharman, who is ex-ITV. So we're getting more and more in bed with each other, I hope. And on that note,
talking about processes, just I think the most important thing I saw during the years was that producers are meeting producers over the barriers and frontiers, and just the best way to meet Australian producers. Here you might meet some of them, but not so many.
There's usually more. There've always been a lot more at Sheffield, but not this year, sadly.
Yeah, let's say it's expensive nevertheless, but for those who want to meet many Australian producers who are very open to work together, that's really what is a fact. They should perhaps try to go once at least to the Australian International Documentary Conference. What normally takes place in February in Adelaide. Or perhaps to the World Congress of Science and Factual, because they are all there, and anyway, they are very good places to go, I think. So, yeah, it's all about process, getting to finance, but getting to know people is really, I think it's getting clearer and clearer. It's something very important. Chris, your DNA.
I had our DNA is, well, the ABC is 80 years old. If you're going to compare the ABC to broadcasting here, we're probably more like BBC One. SBS is probably more like Channel 4. Would that be unfair?
So Channel 4 and BBC 4 mixed, I'd say. Yeah.
So we're 80, as I was saying, we're 80 years old. There's great affection for the ABC. It's known as Auntie. We've traditionally super served the older audience. Generations have grown up with the ABC, particularly out in the bush in the desert areas, you know, the outback. Traditionally, there hasn't been a lot of media and a lot of communication. It's only really been the ABC. So there's great fondness. So that kind of affects our commissions as well. We're like all broadcasters, we're faced with changing demographics, we're faced with fragmentation. So, you know, it's all about being relevant to the audience as well. So when you come to pitches ideas, I mean, we're probably trying to skew younger than we probably would have in the past. I think our core focus for ABC One, we have 4 channels. ABC One is probably more of a family audience. I'm going to keep talking fast because we're going to run out of time. Should we actually run some questions, or should I just keep talking?
Yeah, keep talking.
All right.
We have time.
Okay. Look, just to talk through the nuts and bolts of how we actually commission. Content-wise, we do need some connective tissue to Australian stories. Again, it's very easy for us to pre-buy an acquisition, but our commissioning money is precious and we want to spend it on telling our own stories. However, you know, having said that, we find the gene pool with US and the UK extremely deep and broad. And in actual fact, we do a lot of co-pros. We have basically in natural history, we've got 16 hours in play at the moment with people like Smithsonian, UK TV, ITV, Arte, PBS, Nat Geo. So we are very active. Look, I commission contemporary religion and science. I don't do a lot of co-pros myself. Again, my core remit is to give voice to the issues playing on the nation's mind. But we have other commissioning editors who look after science and history and natural history, and they are very active And I was going to go through some details, but I may not have time. As far as finance plans, they are notoriously incredibly complex. As much as we would love to give a big fat commissioning fee and say go off and make it, the fact is we don't. So the finance plans consist of our licence fee. We pay the rights for 5 runs over 5 years. We kick off anywhere from $20,000 or $30,000 up to $150,000 per hour. So that's about 90-odd thousand pounds. The dollar's sliding about the place at the moment, but it's about that. That money is always matched by Screen Australia, which is our federal government film agency. For international co-pros, we need at least 10% of the budget coming from an overseas DA or broadcaster. We have state agency finance, which comes from each state, for example, Screen New South Wales, Screen Victoria. They have a remit to promote production in their state, so that always configures or normally configure as part of the finance plan. We have a tax rebate scheme where the government, I think you can claim up to 20% of your Australian expenditure. The producers themselves will put investment in. So there are about 6 or 7 strands there to the finance plan. Somehow, occasionally, we actually get that through and we get programs made. We do also need, from your point of view, an Australian producer on board who we hold editorially and financially responsible. So we encourage you to have a partnership there. What else can I say?
I think you have some...
As in...
There's normally, for international co-productions, there's a standard price that we pay, which is normally 120k per hour to access the Screen Australia, if you want it match funded by Screen Australia. So you get 120 from the broadcaster, 120 from Screen Australia, then you probably get some local screen agency money, and then you've got a 20% tax.
No, that's actually wrong.
Oh, sorry.
Screen Australia is...
Oh, so it's not matched. No, it's variable, sorry.
So much more money than that, and I want to get you excited.
Yeah, the screen and agency story is a very complicated one, and
No,
but what we should, clear up a little bit. It would be good.
The fact that the budget for an international co-production, if you get 10% from overseas, the budget can be over $1 million. I mean, basically, that model is very much based on a domestic model. I'm doing 2 international co-productions where the budget is much, much higher than that. So I just wanted to excite you that, I mean, it wouldn't be worth coming to Australia, would it, if you could only get those budgets? But once there is an international component, it really does lift the budget significantly. And if anyone wants to ask more about that later, I'm very happy to tell you a bit more about that.
Generally on budgets, I was at a session yesterday, I think ITV pays something like £37,000 per half hour, is that right? I would not have a budget under 400,000 Australian dollars. Our budgets are generous, mostly between 500 and up to $1 million that I deal with. So look, the business is good. It's a small pool, but it's well resourced in Australia. Look, I think I have time for maybe one clip if I talk really fast.
No, take your time. You have.
Okay.
Yeah.
This first clip is an example where there is actually no Australian content, and there's a bit of a story behind it. The film's called The Grammar of Happiness. It's a 1-hour series. It's a 1-hour program for Smithsonian, Arte and Us. It's about a fellow called Daniel Everett. Daniel Everett used to be a missionary who used to go into the jungle in the Amazon in the 1970s to spread the good word. He lived there with his family. He lived with this particular tribe called the Pitaha, who have a very unusual way of talking. They speak their language, they can hum it, they can sing it. They have no numbers, no words for numbers, no words for colours. They have no sense of a deep past or a sense of a deep future. And what Daniel discovered, which really got everyone excited, was they don't seem to have something called recursion. And recursion is the idea of having a number of thoughts in one sentence. In other words, they have very short sentences, which is all fine and good, except that happens to go against the theory of universal grammar, which is founded by Noam Chomsky. And so all of a sudden there was this huge academic war of words between Chomsky and Daniel Everett. Daniel Everett is actually now a professor of linguistics at Berkeley. And the film was basically to go into the jungle and test the language and to see who's right. I was actually earmarked to direct the film or be one of the directors of the film. Personally, I was quite relieved right in the middle of production I was offered this job at the ABC because it's like a 4-day boat ride into this place. There's no cheeky cafes, no wine bars, there's no air conditioning. They have anacondas, they have spiders and big bugs. So unfortunately, with great regret, I had to hand over the leads to someone else. So I did a little bit of work in the edit room on the film. But this is a lovely scene where we did go into the jungle. Oh, sorry, I didn't say. We were meant to go in with an Australian researcher who was meant to test the language, and at the last minute, the Brazilian authorities pulled the plug, which caused us a lot of stress because we needed to go in there to have an ending for the film, basically. But anyway. That's how we ended up with no Australian content. But we have, that's the story. We have a lovely scene here where Daniel, earlier on in the film, we do go to the jungle. He hasn't seen his tribe, the Pitaha, for some time. And anyway, we should just have a look at the first clip, please.
When Everett first arrived here, he was just 25 years old.
When we landed, the previous missionary flew out with us, and he just stayed for an hour or so and then left, and he taught me 2 phrases which I couldn't repeat. They were just too hard for me then. He said, tell them that you just want to hear Pitaha, and that phrase is, and I couldn't remember any of that, so I was just here sort of dumbfounded, not knowing what to do. There's a Pitaha. There's our first Pitaha. I'm going to go downstairs. So what up it? Yeah, I check up yo I go. I my I say bao I say aba I go. Yeah, I check I go aga. Ege hill. No. Au aga. Okay. Just what I will fight go by so go bagai here I check. I check we see by here I check. So what go by so go bagai here I check. Oh, bike kami go. They just recognize me. Oh, it's always great to see how excited the Pitaha get when I come here. I feel like a rock star after all sometimes when I come in here. But the feeling is mutual. I feel just as excited to see them as they seem to be to see me.
A 4-day boat ride means even today the Pitaha receive few visitors. This is the first time they have seen a film crew.
So anyone who's been in the field to try and get release forms, I don't know if anyone's done that, but that's as close as we got to a consent, I believe. So in actual fact, Dan was actually proved correct, and Chomsky was wrong by the Brain and Cognitive Sciences team from MIT. They went in. They actually went through all the recordings over many years, and look, it's not cut and dry, but the general consensus is that they do in fact do not have recursion. So
how did Chomsky take that?
Not well. he disputes it and disregards it, so that's another story.
Can I ask you about how un-ABC that is?
You can say that's very un-ABC.
That is the most un-ABC film I have ever seen. I'm sitting here thinking, subtitling? You know, like, can you tell us a little bit about how a film like that, I mean, anything's possible, this means.
Well, here's the crazy thing. I didn't actually commission it. I actually have a foot in both camps with this. I was working as a producer for the production company. I had to, it's a long, complicated story, but I ended up doing a lot of work in the edit suite. Then I got the job at ABC, and then I was handed this film at ABC to finish it as a commissioning editor. So, and I still went back in the edit suite and did some work on it. So, why is it on ABC? I don't know. Long story. Long story.
But it's an example of that sometimes, you know, if you're trying to get the measure of what a broadcaster does, they can do something very different if they're persuaded, you know, enough. So subtitling is not something you very often see on the ABC, but you see a lot of it on SBS.
Yeah, well, maybe there's more of that coming up. I think you'll be surprised. This is more ABC. Most of our co-pros are in the natural history arena. But as this example, it's called Kakadu. Kakadu is a big national park in the top end of the Northern Territory. It's produced by Australia's Northern Pictures and Singapore's Beach House Pictures. What's unusual about this is there's no foreign broadcaster. Normally they come attached with some sort of foreign broadcaster. In this case, money came from, something to think about, Singapore's Media Development Authority, the MDA. They give a cash grant for up to 20% of the Singaporean spend. So in this case, the whole series was shot in Australia, but it was all posted in Singapore. They're going to deliver 4 1-hours to us, and they're going to reversion for US and UK. I think they're going to slice it up into half hours. So this has less subtitles. Might be it. Do you want to have a quick look at number 2, please? Yeah.
This is the Aboriginal land of Kakadu in Australia's Northern Territory. At 20,000 square kilometres, it's Australia's largest terrestrial national park, one of our greatest natural treasures. Rangers and traditional owners work to try and hold on to its magic. It's a land of wild extremes. Scorching hot one season and torrential rain the next. Floods, fire, feral animals, and deadly saltwater crocodiles are just a few of the challenges they face.
Okay, 2, 3, go! Down there, back.
They must also manage the thousands of visitors the park attracts each year.
This is our Jabiru ambulance. We're going to get you back to the clinic.
It's a frontier community.
If something goes wrong, you're on your own.
I'm awarded. You have committed an offence. All right, heroes, steady up. Be visual.
Where man meets wild.
Crocodile could be lying down there anywhere.
And nature calls the shots. This is Kakadu.
So that's typical for us in that our natural history and our science is always driven by characters and story. That's the aperture that we always like to look through. In that case, it's the park rangers and it's the emergency crews. So keep that very much in mind. I am personally a story Nazi, and my colleagues are as well. Look, Katrina Sedgwick heads the ABC Arts Department. She unfortunately couldn't make it to Sheffield this year, which is a pity because she has lots of hours in production, which includes Your Wizards of Oz. I don't have a clip because it's in production and there's no footage yet, but one of her programs she's doing is on a fellow called Frank Gehry. He's one of the world's most famous architects, apparently. I'm not an expert when it comes to art. He's 84 years young. And construction has just begun on his first Australian building. Now, in Australia, we don't have a very good reputation when it comes to how we treat our international architects. The Sydney Opera House comes to mind. And debate is already raging about Frank's latest building that just happens to be right next door to our studios in Sydney. Can we have a look at the picture? Wow. It's not from Beirut or Syria. That's going to be right. I think that's our building just behind it. And it's going to chop out some of our harbour glimpses. So, of course, we have no opinion whatsoever.
Hell has harbour views.
Some people liken it to a big crumpled paper bag. So we're doing a co-pro with BBC One's Imagine. I believe that's hosted by Alan Yentob.
Yesterday.
Yeah, we look, with all due respect, I think they're going to be doing their own version with Alan. We don't particularly want Alan in our version, so I think the BBC is going to take our rough cut, and I think Alan will do his own interview and they'll recut it. So, but anyway, there's a shared DNA there, so that's an example where a co-pro can be reversioned and very adequately serve both markets. And I'll just have one final clip. We have a great love-in with the BBC at the moment when it comes to history. A recent production was a series called Desert War, which is produced by Electric Pictures and Utopia. It's an action-packed, slightly reversionist account of the Siege of Tobruk and the battle for El Alamein. Military history is a good shared DNA for us, for all the obvious reasons. Having said that, we're slightly overstocked with military films at the moment because of the forthcoming centenary of World War I. But look, I think this features some of the best dramatic recreations we've ever seen. It was actually filmed in the West Australian desert, which is a pretty good analogue for North Africa. So we'll just have a look at that clip too, please.
Coming at them, the toughest, most experienced fighting force in the world.
Und wir waren immer optimistisch. Wir haben tatsächlich in Ruhestellung, wir haben auch im Gefecht haben wir manchmal gesungen.
The Germans, they were magic words. No one would stop them.
Left radius.
And now we were going to meet them.
8-400.
The Australian infantry and the British artillery went into that battle knowing that the fate of the war depended on them.
All these screening planes coming down and letting a bomb straight at you. If anybody wasn't frightened, well, they weren't human. Well, I saw the tanks. and I saw the infantry behind them, and they were coming towards us. It was an absolute circus.
Powerful. Thank you very much, Chris. I don't want to end with the war. Wouldn't feel good. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. It was very rich, but I warned you, it's complex. So maybe you would like to profit from these people to have a question or two. Everything clear? Yeah. Okay. I'll go. Perhaps you have a phone. Yeah.
I was just wondering, is there some sort of online resource where I can find out about Australian production companies and also about yourselves, obviously, about resources, the spending conditions?
Look at the Screen Australia website, and SBS has a website. We have a website, ABC Documentaries. I can tell you what it is. Look it up.
Margaret, does the Producers Association do
do you know, I don't really know. There is a book called, what's the directory called, Tim? The Encore.
Encore, yeah.
Encore is probably online as well. But Screen Australia is sort of probably a good first point of contact for looking at what's been commissioned. They list everything that's been commissioned and the budget and who the producers are. So if you wanted to get an overview of the last 4 or 5 years of what's been produced and who by, that would be a good start, I think.
And they probably more elegantly explain their funding as well. It's screenaustralia.gov.au, and if you look at our website, we're abc.net.au/TV/documentaries.
But in terms of producers, I think in a way, the ones who are bothering to come to the international markets are the ones who'll have the experience of international co-pro. So, I mean, amazing. If you could get to AIDC, there you'll certainly meet, pretty much all the Australian producers. But I'd say, World Congress of Science and Factual Producers, Sheffield, Sunnyside. Australians do normally get out quite a lot. Any excuse for a trip.
Who's talking?
Well, I know, yeah.
This guy.
Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you. It was a very informative discussion. Obviously, I'm Australian. Excuse me in advance. But I don't live in Australia. I live in Afghanistan. I've been living there for 7 years.
Wow.
And my story is about Afghanistan. Obviously, I'm part of that story as well. But for me to have a production house in Australia, would it be possible for me to set up my own and therefore qualify for those kind of funds you guys are talking about through Screen Australia, etc.? And if that is possible, how would I go about that? What would be the sort of procedure? Is it hard? Is it difficult to take many years? What would I expect?
It's a very big question, and I'm very happy to talk to you about it later if you want.
Sorry.
It's a very big question. There is a rule about residency that you can't just set up a company and then not be there at all. But I would probably suggest to you that there might be other. You look young and groovy to me from up here, but the lights are in my eyes, so you may be old and horrible. But you look young and groovy, and I think there's probably some great younger demographic people in Australia that you could maybe work with first. Maybe setting up your own company immediately might be a little bit difficult, or you might find a partner that you could have a relationship where they exist in Australia and you're still able to be in Afghanistan. I mean, that's an incredibly exciting possibility for an Australian producer too, I think, to have maybe someone like you in the mix. But I'm happy to answer more fulsomely later.
In this case, perhaps Jane Roscoe could also be of some
Yes, very helpful.
Help. Yeah, there was a very last question
Hello.
Or two, I don't know, because we have to leave then. We have to catch our trains and to leave the room.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've got a quick question for everyone. I've made quite a few co-productions in between Australia and the UK. And I'm just really surprised at how few British producers there are here, and how few British producers seem to be aware of the scale of the budgets that we get. I made a film last year for the BBC and ABC, the Chateau Chunda wine revolution, and
brilliant film.
Yeah, it was great fun. And I had a budget of $800,000, which I don't think any directors get to work with in the UK, and that money is available, and there are great stories to be told. There's huge development departments all over the UK, all these thousands of indies. I just find it quite amazing how few are kind of knocking on our doors in Australia for that kind of access to that kind of money, and why there are no British producers kind of on that panel, or very few in this room.
There's a lot in the room.
Why you think that might be?
The few people that are in the room.
Well, Stephen, I mean, to answer that from my point of view, I partly think that you know, being from the UK, you can get very UK-centric. I think Britain is that is an issue. And I think more and more, as there are issues with budgets, you have to look overseas. I think actually Arte are much more outward-looking, for example, than Channel 4. I mean, I love Channel 4, but I would say that is the truth.
That's my experience, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Margie's got a different story, but.
It's like it's a big secret that hasn't kind of been...
It's very hard, Steve. I think you're putting a very positive spin on it, and I wanted to too, because these people have come along and given up their time, and we don't want to be sad sacks, but it is really, really, really difficult. I mean, yes, they're big budgets, so maybe it is worth working for them, but as these guys have eloquently, I think, expressed, they need the Australian angle and Australian content, and that's not that easy. I mean, one of the things that I've often felt helps is if you've, I mean, I'm quite surprised at how many Australians are doing extraordinary things around the world, and so having an Australian, the head of, I mean, at one stage here, the head of every major arts institution in Britain was Australian. The Edinburgh Festival, the South Bank Centre, the head of ethics at Oxford is an Australian. So for me, it was always, oh, well, can I sell the Australian person? But even that's not enough. Often it's not enough for Australia, and it's not enough for the UK. It wouldn't be enough for, I mean, the French are much more open, interestingly, than the Brits. They really are. But it's not that easy. Talk to Steve. He's just up there, and if he.
No, but essentially, he's right. That's a little bit why we set up the panel also. But it's far away, and there are barriers in minds. They have not to be there, but I insist, go and meet the producers on international marketplaces, and everything seems less complicated. So that's what I keep telling also to international producers, because there is indeed a huge potential, and I have the same question as you have, but I have to finish this panel now. I'm sorry, we have to finish. But please, I don't know, some of these people will perhaps stay some minutes, and you could have the direct contact with us every time, the best thing to do. A very warm thank you to the technical team.
Yes.
Documentary
Thank you.
Documentary Campus, who is organizing this, and to you for your interest, and of course to this wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thanks.